I'm delighted to be here today, and I have to confess, in addition to talking about my work, I really wanted to find out more about these types of educational activities. Being at a state university, it's becoming more and more important for us to justify our existence, not just in terms of federal grants and research, but as a land-grant campus, what we give back to the people of the state. And I'm going to go through a couple of these very quickly to acknowledge generous support that I've had over the years from NIAAA, and also that I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And the main points that I want to discuss today are, there's multiple etiological pathways to alcohol use disorder. In the psychopathology area, we sometimes call that equifinality. That is, people start out in different places, but they often wind up in the same place because of different processes. And within that, to highlight that personality traits play a very important role in most of these. It's not like there's a personality pathway and then another type of pathway, but that personality's fingers extends into multiple pathways. And the ones I'm going to talk about today, and it's not exhaustive, are individual differences in alcohol effects, drinking motivation, and niche seeking or environmental selection. The other point that I'm going to really highlight, and this is relatively new, and if people don't have a background in personality, modern personality research or developmental psychology, they might not appreciate the fact that people now view personality as much more mutable than they used to. It's still a relatively stable trait, but it changes systematically over the course of development. Thank God, that we're not the same way we were when we were 5. But also there's big individual differences in the extent to which people do change. And it changes cross-situationally, but also across major life transitions. The last part is something that is a bit more speculative for the future, that personality might prove to be an important target for interventions. And when I say the future, there's a paper by David Barlow that I'll show a little later. It should be Back to the Future, because that's where a lot of intervention research started. That's what psychoanalysis is about. And so even though people who are die-hard behaviorists that say you want to change behavior, target behavior, is we're now starting to look at what's under the skin as perhaps important in terms of determining how people act out in the real world. So this is a ridiculously complex figure that I drew up almost 30 years ago. Actually, it probably was originally 30 years ago. It appeared in a book in 1991. When I was commissioned by the MacArthur Foundation to summarize everything we know about children of alcoholics. And so I took the task pretty seriously. I wasn't as busy then, so I was able to devote a lot more time to it. And then after I had read pretty much everything I could find about the correlates of children of alcoholics and a variety of related topics on functioning of alcoholic families, long-term predictors of alcoholism, I put together this map, if you will. It kind of looks like a path diagram where the solid lines are at least theorized to play causal roles, and the dashed lines are moderating roles. That is, they influence some of these causal paths. And the point I'm going to make is that personality or temperament plays a central role. I kind of look at it as a quarterback almost, in terms of these different pathways. And the pathways that I highlighted at the time, one we called negative affectivity, which is related to just tending to become anxious or depressed, and is that serving as a motivation for engagement in alcohol for mood regulation or coping. Another pathway we discussed was what I call deviance proneness. And that's associated with a generally deviant lifestyle, becoming affiliated with deviant peers, relatively high levels of impulsivity, failure to fulfill a number of important developmental tasks. And then the last one is ethanol sensitivity. That is how arousing or depressing tranquilizing a given dose of alcohol is. We don't all respond to alcohol in the same way. And in fact, in a couple minutes, I'll talk about the earliest work. Is anybody in here a doctoral student? I would just like to say, I'm going to talk briefly about some work that was my dissertation, which means you could carry around your dissertation for 40 years. So that's just, I don't know if that's a burden you want to think about at this point, but it's sometimes, for some people, something that sticks to you for a while. And so these are data that are from before my dissertation. I was working in a psychophysiology lab with Bob Levinson, who was my mentor. And there was a lot of debate at the time about whether or not alcohol is tension or stress reducing. And the literature was very ambiguous. Some studies suggesting yes, some studies suggesting no. And so we decided, well, what we're going to do is we're going to try and do as definitive a test as can be done. One is we're really going to stress these people more so than typical and use stressors that are very robust. And in this study, this is interbeat intervals, so we could just think of that as the inverse of heart rate. Have people relax, put up a sign that something you're going to have to do in 5 minutes is going to be very stressful, or we tell them they're going to have to do something. They see what it is, and it is stressful. There's a countdown, and they're told they're either going to get a painful electric shock, or they're going to have to make a self-disclosing speech about what they like and dislike about their body and physical appearance. You can see both are pretty stressful. These are, it's not unusual for us to get 30, 40 beat per minute increase. For those of you familiar with some of research on emotion and stress, people often will induce a 2 beat per minute increase of 5 beat. This is a way, it's called a pseudo-conditioning paradigm, where you really constrain someone's attention, there's a countdown. So anyway, okay, we got the stressor. And the other piece too is people would often use middling doses of alcohol, and we were going to use a gram per kilogram dose. And I should say these were all men. If it was women, we would have used a somewhat smaller dose, probably about 90% of it, which would get the average participant up to a BAC of about 0.1%, which at the time was the legal limit in most states. As you know, it's been reduced by 20% now. And so when I was trying to figure out what to do for my dissertation, I went through a lot of individual difference measures that we had collected incidentally as part of the project. And one of the things we looked at were people high and low on the McAndrew alcoholism scale, which is MMPI. I don't know if everybody knows what an MMPI is, but it's a commonly used clinical assessment instrument that has multiple scales. And this is actually a derived scale that distinguishes people who are clinically alcoholic, in other words, are in treatment, from outpatients. So it's not versus normal, people with other kinds of problems. So you're kind of controlling for that general treatment seeking part. And one of the things we discovered is, as you can see, those people who are high on McAndrew are the people who showed the effect. But this was data snooping. This was all post hoc, looking around in the data to see if we could find anything. So we thought, well, for my dissertation, I tried to I published this, but replicate it, put them together as a package. And so we did the same thing, only this time not just high and low on McAndrew, but we wanted to make sure they were really antisocial. So they also had to be high on McAndrew and low on socialization, or low on McAndrew and high on socialization. So these were people who were relatively pure. They met the threshold on 2 separate instruments, and we found the same effect, that it was only those people who showed these high levels of antisocial and impulsive traits. And this was later replicated again in that lab and in Bob Peel's lab in Montreal. And so it was like, wow, not everybody gets the same tranquilizing type effect. It's actually a little more complicated than that, but I think that just demonstrates the notion. Individual differences in personality relate to individual differences in alcohol effects. But this really, it turns out, like many things in psychology, is not a new idea. 90 years ago, William McDougall, who's probably the most influential English-speaking psychologist at the time. He had been the William James Professor of Psychology at Harvard. He founded the department at Duke. and noted the markedly extroverted personality is very susceptible to the influence of alcohol. A very small dose deprives them of normal self-restraint and control and brings on the symptoms of intoxication, all of which are essentially expressions of diminished cortical control over lower brain levels. That's basically the modern model of effects of alcohol on executive function and frontal control mechanisms. Even though McDougall is never actually cited, but this was not on the basis of extensive experimentation across most sides. This was just, he sees it in his friends, people he knows, and it's interesting just where good ideas, or at least generative ideas, could come from is careful observation, as well as knowing a lot of psychology to begin with. For those of you who are more in the clinical realm and are familiar with the concept of psychopathy, kind of the father of psychopathy, Hervey Cleckley, maybe some of you know him from, who also wrote The Three Faces of Eve, or was actually a co-author of The Three Faces of Eve. That might be a little bit dated for many of you. But he noted psychopathic personalities exhibit fantastic and uninviting behavior after a drink. And he goes, and sometimes without. So there's really two interesting pieces to that. There are some people who are exquisitely sensitive to certain kinds of effects of alcohol, but it's not like they're necessarily not like that when they're sober. There's been a lot of work on things related to disinhibition, and I cite here some work by Peter Giancola. Actually, it's a number of studies by Peter Giancola, where he did this very large alcohol challenge study where they bring people into the lab, they provoke them, and then they see how aggressively they respond to an imagined opponent. There's a lot of deception involved in this work, but the bottom line is he had this very large sample, and then he systematically looked at what variables predicted who are the people who responded particularly aggressively. And it was people with high levels of trait hostility, aggression, low levels of empathy, which actually fits in well with the psychopathy construct, as well as executive control, which was assessed via a battery of neuropsychological tests. And when we look at individual differences in alcohol effects, we typically do it at this level, like I was showing you stress response. Here is aggressive responding. But we were interested is, are they more broad transformations? And so a former student of mine, Rachel Winograd, started a research program, and I'm going to just show you a couple of findings from it over several years, where we first asked people, like, fill out this questionnaire, how you typically are sober, a personality assessment. Do it as you would when you're typically drunk. And we asked people to, we only asked people who were regular drinkers. And that you could see that they saw themselves as more extroverted, a little bit less agreeable. The conscientiousness, when it was up a little, would surprise us, but deeply and then lower on intellect. But interestingly, we also had them come to the lab with their best friend, who was a drinking buddy. And we had them rate each other, so it wasn't just a self-report, which could just be their own expectancy, and the results were virtually identical, at least in terms of mean level. The agreement was not as high, but the mean patterns were similar. And then getting back to, we said, well, are there like configural changes that tend to characterize different people? And at least on the basis of self-report, we're able to identify 4 types, which we label the Hemingway, who was somebody you didn't really see much in terms of their baseline changes, but they really showed virtually no effect of alcohol. I had been reading a biography of American alcoholic writers, and Hemingway was infamous for not only being a very heavy drinker and very alcohol dependent, but of taking great pride in the fact that people, he maintained his comportment throughout. And if you actually read it, he's very petty towards people like Fitzgerald, who were sloppy drunks, because he was, a very composed drunk. And Mary Poppins, who's just normally very agreeable, but then even increased more in their agreeableness. Mr. Hyde, who we didn't see that much in terms of their sober state, but showed across-the-board changes, particularly in those things that are related to hostility, like agreeableness, and then restraint, like conscientiousness. And then the nutty professor, who was somewhat extroverted and then became much less, actually, their extroversion increased after being somewhat introverted. The only one we found that was particularly related to problems was the one we called Mr. Hyde. And I don't want to over-reify it. It's a point here is there may be some characteristic patterns of people. And it's interesting, when I talk to various kinds of general audience, I say, well, do you know someone you would call a bad drunk? Or whatever, and everybody says, yeah. Ironically, or perhaps curiously, you go through the alcohol research literature, there's like nothing on bad drunks. You know, and in fact, part of the motivation here was to take what's out there in the lay literature a little bit and to see, could we find some instantiation? And Rachel believed that if we could actually use this in motivational interviewing and other kinds of contexts to point out how somebody wants to be and how somebody is perhaps while they're drinking. So it would just be a little bit more leverage for the therapist. And then that was all self-report. This is just to highlight, and Rachel amazed me. We were able to put together an experimental study on an F-31 and some discretionary funds that I had that normally would have taken $1 million and $1.5 million to do, where we brought groups of drinking buddies into the lab, all same sex, and gave them either alcohol or a controlled beverage, had them engage in a variety of different tasks, taping them all the time, and then we had raters rate them. Just want to highlight the most robust effects we have that I'm showing here was in the area of extroversion, where we're able to document changes on traditional personality type traits in these extroversion facets of gregariousness, assertiveness, and activity. So personality has something to do with alcohol effects. Does it have to do with what people think about how alcohol affects them? And before I get to that, I just want to highlight there's thousands of studies. I don't think that's hyperbole. I mean, 30 years ago, there were hundreds of studies, and there's more now. I can't countless dissertations looking at various kind of personality traits and alcoholism. And they all tend to show that people who are alcohol dependent or alcohol addicted, we could use a variety of different labels, show relatively high levels of disinhibition and negative affectivity, but is known for many years. It doesn't distinguish the consequences of alcoholism from those pre-morbid characteristics that presage later alcohol problems. And so it's helpful then to look at the prospective associations. And we typically see in a variety of different prospective studies that disinhibition, impulsivity predicts most robustly, and to a lesser degree, neuroticism and negative emotionality. And then usually only when it's pretty severe and in a certain context. Extroversion, positive emotionality, sometimes, and I'll get to that a little bit later. This is data from a study my colleague at Missouri, Wendy Slutsky, published in the early 2000s, showing that these major personality traits are genetically related to alcoholism. That is, the same genes that are contributing to alcoholism are contributing to these personality traits. And so when we talk about, and again, you'll be hearing a lot more, and I'm interested in hearing what they say, is when we talk about the genes for alcoholism, they're not necessarily the genes that are specific to alcoholism. There are some that probably are, but that much of the heritability that we see from biometric twin studies is actually due to common shared variances with personality traits. And then another point I'm going to make along this line, this is a study I did with my colleague Tim Trull in 1994, where we looked at the personality profiles of a number of different disorders in this cohort I was studying. And one of the things that you noticed, regardless of what disorder we're studying, an SUD or an anxiety disorder or depression, there's real similarities in that they're all associated with higher neuroticism and lower conscientiousness. And we could think of conscientiousness being related to impulsivity, lack of perseverance, lack of planning, making decisions on the basis of very quickly without a lot of deliberation. And in fact, this notion that these personality traits like neuroticism and conscientiousness are related to psychopathology in general, including alcohol use disorders, is very robust in the literature. In other words, it's not, so many of the things I'm going to be talking about today, it's not specific to alcohol use disorder. It's specific to a lot of psychopathology. In fact, there's been a movement recently in psychopathology, actually away from nosology, to say there's a big glom out there, which, to be honest, I don't know what to make of it, but it's sometimes called the P factor. You've heard of like the G factor for intelligence. Avshalom Caspi and Terry Moffat and their colleagues have introduced the notion of P factor, that there's this large overarching trait that manifests itself in different ways for different disorders. And in fact, recently there's a group who calls themselves the high top group, the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology group, which is offering this dimensional alternative to psychopathology, where we could see the substance-related disorders under substance abuse, which is part of disinhibition, but it's still related to this higher order factor of general psychopathology. So this is where I was leading before, is people respond differently to alcohol. Does that mean they think differently about alcohol might affect them? And so one of the things we were interested in is, how do alcohol expectancies, that is, do you believe alcohol is going to have a positive transformative effect on you, relate to personality? And so again, many years ago we demonstrated it was related to traits related to behavioral under control or impulsivity. And now I'm going to totally change track for a bit to highlight the developmental piece I want to bring in. And so talk about the prevalence of alcohol use disorders, at least in the general population. And this is, it says age at baseline. So add 3 years to all of this. So that's like 21 to 23. And this is from a big national epidemiologic survey. And what you see is it goes down dramatically over the course of adulthood. And these are cross-sectional data, so it's going to be confounded to some extent by cohort effects, by differential mortality. But by and large, it's a big effect. And those other things really, from everything else we know, can't explain them. And so it's like, what's going on? And one of the things that Alvaro, a former graduate student of mine who's in Catholic University of Santiago now, showed that if we look at the people who are diagnosing in a given year, how many of those people had previously diagnosed, either at the previous time of assessment or prior to that. So one is chronic, the other we call recurrent, versus new onset. They had no previous alcohol use disorder, but they did in follow-up. And one of the things we could see, and there's a lot more analyses that back this up, is that a lot of that decrease is due to, and we'll get into that a little bit more too, refined, but a lot of the decrease is the decrease in primarily new onsets of disorders, that there's something about early adulthood, late adolescent that generates much of this. So you are hearing about Spit for Science. That's a lot of the action is going on in this period of life. It's not to say later life isn't important. In fact, there's a lot of concern now about big increases in people 60 years and older. I'm part of a meta-analysis that Rick Rooks at WashU is doing, looking at 5 different surveys, all showing the most reliable effect that's happened over the last 10 years is increases in drinking, as well as, and it's been documented from other sources, alcohol-related morbidities in that older group. So by saying that, I don't mean to say older people aren't important, but in terms of where the general burden is in terms of alcohol use consumption, it's in the younger folks. And so why the big difference in prevalence? And the major explanation usually is called maturing out, that people have, maybe they still like to drink. They're in college, they're having a good time, but now they have a job, they have kids, They might want to party, but they can't. You know, they have too many responsibilities. So these environmental constraints rein them in somewhat, and particularly these environmental roles that are incompatible with a heavy drinking lifestyle. And so here's some exemplary data. This is from the Monitoring the Future study. People who are single at 2 times, and this is in a long-term follow-up, prospective study, are relatively high in their binge drinking across both measurement occasions. Those who are married, relatively low. Those who are divorced at both times, relatively high. But the important, interesting data are the ones who change status. And you see the ones who are single who get married are partying less, for lack of a better phrase. And the ones who get divorced are going up. And that's true for the men. It's also true for the women. So this looks like a powerful environmental effect. Those within-subject comparisons are very telling, at least showing those correlated changes. I am going to play a little strip in a second of Zia McCabe, who is the keyboardist for the Dandy Warhols, if anybody knows who the Dandy Warhols are. And here, she was pretty wild. You know, she'd perform topless at these outdoor concerts in Europe. And then if you browse the web, you'll also, then she becomes the picture of domesticity, you know, when she's pregnant. And so I thought Zia is a really good exemplar of somebody who's going from the discontrolled to what seems to be very conventional piece. So here's this, and probably everybody's seen Rock and Roll Mamas 100 times, but so bear with me here.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely have, because, you know, I was known as Secret Agent McCabe, and it was all about getting the party started and leading everybody from one party to the next, and that's definitely, you know, a comment that Courtney had made when someone was kind of reminiscing about that being my role, and he said this kind of, you know, oh, that's how it used to be thing, and I mean, I've definitely proved otherwise, that it's not really how it used to be, it's just not what I do as my full-time lifestyle. It's definitely something that, you know, we've kind of worked it out that one night per tour, Travis takes Matilda, and I get to go and wake up with a horrific hangover. And I get one, and so I pick one. And, you know, like one tour, it was, okay, Primal Scream is here, the Happy Mondays are here. This is the night that I stay out as late as I want. And it's great, I get to go do that, and it's really fun. And I don't end up at typically the lame parties, the ones that you're like, God, why am I here? This sucks, just because I have to go out and drink all the time and look for a party. So it's kind of, I get the best parties, I get one of them, and you know, sometimes I have to fly the next day, and I cannot even believe that I made that decision, because even the one party seemed like too much. But I do need it. You know, when you're pregnant, you kind of think you're turning into an angel, and you're never going to party again, and you're never going to stay up late and have a hangover or any of that stuff, because you're this perfect, pure vessel for this child. And then you have the kid, and you go, well, you know, I do like hanging out with these friends, and I do like going and getting rowdy, and I am in a rock band. This is what I do and what I'm really happy doing, and I never expected to to become a mom. You just kind of, you just don't see how they're going to fit together. You do want that, but you don't think you're going to do it. You know, it just doesn't, and then you just slowly realize that you just pick and choose, and you pick your special times to go do that, and you have to be still great and fun and happy in the morning, no matter what. And that's the one difference, rather than just like the rest of the guys can just stay, you know, assed out for the rest of the day in their bed and get room service. And sometimes I get a luck out, we don't have to travel the next day, and Travis takes Matilda off to an aquarium or something, and it's really nice. But I'm totally accepted the fact that I just have to wake up and look like I'm still having fun, and I feel good when I don't. And lots of people have to do that for their jobs. Most people have to get up the next day and go act like they feel good, so it's not like I'm the only person on the planet doing that.
So that's Zia explaining role and compatibility pretty well, I think. How do you fit in this like partying lifestyle with the demands of being a mom and being on tour? So the question is that is that all there is? You know, Denise Kandel really promoted this as the primary reason why we see these big desistance curves, this decrease in drinking in the third decade of life. And we were curious because other stuff is going on during this period of time. This is a picture or a graph of changes in personality traits, and I highlight two here. Conscientiousness, which we can kind of think of as the opposite of impulsivity, and emotional stability, which we could think of as the opposite of neuroticism. And what we see is, over the life course, people become more conscientious and less neurotic. And if we look at where it seems to be particularly steep, it's during the same period of time where we're seeing all this desistance of alcohol problems. So we were curious, do these two phenomena relate to each other? We go and we looked at the data in our study. This is a 1987 cohort that we followed up to age 35, and we see, consistent with the Robbins et al. Meta-analysis, that yeah, our subjects are reporting lower levels of impulsivity and lower levels of neuroticism as they age. And if we just look at a measure of alcohol problems, we see a similar looking decrease, but that's not to say they're related in any way or correlated. So we put them together and modeled them through what's called bivariate growth curve. And we basically showed that the baseline correlation at age 18 between personality is comparable to the correlation between the slopes of impulsivity change and alcohol involvement change. That is, we're seeing these two rates of change correlated together. And that's after we controlled for the role transition into marriage or parenthood. We do see that there is an effect of marriage and parenthood on alcohol problems. Not much on impulsivity in this study. But even despite that change, so it looked like we're seeing this coupling of personality and drinking that changes developmentally as a function of normal developmental change in personality. So we would say it doesn't look like it's all role incompatibility. And we see the same thing with neuroticism. And here, with neuroticism, we also see, though, a change of marriage increasing emotional stability. And you see similar things if you look at secure attachment and other things that are supposedly very stable and trait-like. And we replicate this across a variety of different modeling techniques, across different kinds of personality assessment. And one of the best things we did in this study was we measured personality repeatedly. Most people didn't. They assumed it was stable, so they measure it at baseline and just say it stays fixed that way, and saw it as a fixed covariate rather than as a time-varying covariate. So that decision allowed us to look at that. And it's unfortunate because I think there'd probably be a lot more data out there had people repeated their assessments over time of personality. And then the other question is, okay, well, people's personalities are changing. Why might that relate to how much they're drinking? And so my colleague at Missouri, Lynn Cooper, had done a lot of work with developing measures of drinking motivation, and focusing on a model that Miles Cox and Eric Klinger had developed many years ago of thinking the 4 broad domains of substance use motive. Now, I do want to say this works well with alcohol. When we start talking about other drugs, they usually are adding other motivation in too. So if we're talking about cannabis, they talk about expansiveness. If we talk about smoking, habit is very important. But with drinking, this seems to carry most of the variance, and really focusing on enhancement and coping. Basically, drinking to get high, get a buzz, get tipsy, or coping, in other words, for anxiolysis, for anxiety reduction, for mood regulation. And if we look in our study, we see decreases in enhancement motivation over that time. We have a little bit of a weird thing going on with coping, and I should say this preceded Lynn's measure, so we don't have as psychometrically sound a measure as we would have liked to, but we see it decreasing to about 29 for coping, and then it pops up in the mid-30s, which is interesting, and I wish we had later time points with that. But I'm not going to take you through all of the analyses, but what we find is that, at least with the coping, we could model much of the change in drinking associated with personality change to changes in coping. And so the emergent model is personality is changing, and the needs or the strategies for coping change, and that ultimately affects. We didn't find it for enhancement, but I think it's because we really only had a single item for enhancement. The reasons for drinking scales that were available to us at the time when we started did not really map that domain very well. So I would not put too much emphasis on that. So maturing out isn't just role incompatibility. It looks like it's related to normative personality change, and some of this might be related to the reasons why people drink. Now I'm going to shift gears again and talk about environmental selection. And that is, we're all moving into different environments all the time. To some extent, I'm probably not a great example. I always consider my life kind of a random walk. But most people, really they choose environments on the basis of if it's exciting, if it's comforting, if it has certain features that resonate with important core values. And those are personality-based, but environments tend to vary about how wet they are or how dry they are. One of the things we've studied at Missouri is a really wet environment, and that's the Greek system. And on most campuses that have been studied, the Greek system represents the center of drinking culture on campus. Is that true here too? Maybe you're not allowed to say. Anyway, it's true at most places. And it's kind of a phenomenon to me. I went to a hippie college in the 70s that didn't have anything like a Greek system. The closest was the volunteer fire department because there was a bunch of guys who lived in a building together. But I live on I work on a campus now with a very strong Greek system. And anywhere it's been in, usually when I go and give a talk, I'll look up what's going on that campus, and there's been some horrendous event in the last year that's gotten the attention of senior administrators and others. But I highlight some national news of the last year of what's gone on at Penn State, in Ohio State, and even in Time magazine. No, this is the New York Times Sunday magazine with Frank Bruni arguing that we should get rid of the Greek system. So it's a timely issue right now, and a lot of it has to do with its alcohol involvement. So we started a cohort study, different than the one in '87, because this one we tried to get all incoming first-time freshmen. And I think we did a pretty good job of it. We had amazing cooperation, which we've tried to do since, and they won't be as cooperative, but where we actually had part of summer welcome. Summer welcome is protected more so than Fort Knox in terms of everybody needing there. Is that true here too? It's hard to get a piece of summer welcome. But back in 2002, they let us get a piece of summer welcome, which made a huge difference in terms of our recruiting success. And so we were able to follow most of well over 3,000 people over 4 years. We're talking about, I'm going to highlight the first three. This just documents that the Greek students drank more. But here's one analysis, that shows that people who are drinking more heavily are the people who select into the Greek system. We have a lot of things about people who affiliate late, people who disaffiliate, but just for now, and I'm not going to talk about those, but just for now, we see there is a socialization effect. That means once you're in the Greek system, you're going to tend to drink more, both during the intercept is at the first semester, but also over the rest of the course of your time there. So heavier drinkers select in, but once you're in, you're going to drink even more, initially and then in a continued way. But then we added some personality variables that we had gotten. And there were a couple of interesting things, and I'm going to focus here on the impulsivity correlates well with the pre-college heavy drinking. And that's the assessment of the prior 3 months we got during summer welcome before they had matriculated. Extroversion correlates a tiny bit. But what we found interesting was after we control for pre-college heavy drinking going into Greek status is really not an impulsivity relation effect. If anything, it's negative, it's a suppressor effect. But that extroversion is really strongly associated, which actually kind of makes sense in terms of the kinds of social activities that the Greek system provides. And it gave us this insight into the fact that most of the environments that we're interested in are multifaceted. Somebody could want to select into the Greek system, not because they want to drink a lot, but because they like a lot of the other positive things that are associated with Greek societies. But once you're in there, it's what my social psychologist friends would call a social trap. You're in a heavy drinking environment. And so I think it's important to try and distinguish the selection into an environment from the environmental effects that it has. So individuals select into fraternities and sorority, both for traits strongly related to alcohol seeking, like how much they're drinking before they get there, but traits that are incidental to drinking, but it still puts them at high risk. And that's why I'm saying extroversion in certain environments will predict, because it predicted the selection into that environment in the first place. So I think we want to understand as best we can how to create environments for individuals that are compatible with their needs, but are not necessarily dangerous. What about personality and role selection? This is some recent publication with a postdoc, Matt Lee, and just to show that people who are more conscientious tend to select into marriage earlier. And we could talk about those issues more, but I just want to make the point it's not just larger macro environmental, or actually it's kind of still micro, but social relationships as well as more discrete kinds of environments. It's interesting to say, does drinking change your personality more chronically? And I suspect that it does. There's actually a lot of debate in the literature now. My synthesis of what I've seen so far is there might be short-term effects associated with heavy consumption, but that if we look at these longer-term effects where we start seeing normative changes over a long period of time, it seems to be more personality-driven than the consumption driven. But that's a question still to be resolved. There might be people who would take issue with me on that. So what do we need to look going forward? And I think one is I've been dealing with personality traits at a very global level. And so we need to have more facet information. I've been using the term impulsivity in ways that would upset an impulsivity researcher, because now people don't use the term impulsivity very much anymore. They'll talk about, sensation seeking, which is a lack of planning, lack of perseverance, negative urgency, positive urgency, and those are all actually very distinct constructs. They all relate to consumption to varying degrees. But to the extent they're related to like negative urgency, the tendency to act rashly when distressed, is actually a facet of neuroticism. But lack of planning is a facet of conscientiousness. Lack of perseverance is a facet of conscientiousness. Sensation seeking fits usually under extroversion, depending upon the personality system you're in. The other issue is, are there critical periods of drug exposure that limit late maturation? I'm a consultant on a prospective neuroimaging project that meets every year with a consortium that focuses on effects of alcohol on development in rodent models. And one of the things that they're very interested in rodent models, are there periods of development where you don't recover from if the alcohol insult is too big? And it's looking like in rodents, we don't really have comparable data in humans, like 12 or 13. There might be some really critical periods in adolescent development when the brain, just because of what the brain is going through at that time and what the inflammatory processes and epigenetic processes occur during that time, you might lock in an effect. And we don't really know that yet, but it's important, and whether or not there's going to be some people who are more fixed or malleable, and if that relates to the timing. And then the other question is, how do we facilitate personality maturation? I think from research, it's something we've been doing for many years is it useful to come up with subtypes? I think the jury is still out on that, but it's still an active area of research, probably not as active as the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I think we need to really think about personality in context. And that not only do people select into that, but we know from a large literature in personality and social psychology that personality environment interactions often explain more of the variance than either of those alone. And is this notion of sober and drunken personality a very useful tool for the clinician to have? Now, there have been some adaptations already of personality piece. Patricia Conrad has developed different interventions for adolescents based on their predominant personality trait. So if somebody's high in anxiety, sensitivity versus high in sensation seeking, she has different interventions for them. You know, I've always been a little bit dissatisfied with that. I say, well, what happens if you give a sensation-seeking intervention to an anxiety sensitivity person? And she says, well, we can't do that experimental crossing because they drop out. And so, you know, I would say the data are not as totally convincing as I was like, but at least it shows that it is at least effective for these groups. And then the other piece that I'll show you in a second is, can we just treat whatever the presenting problems are that aren't substance use? Does that help personality? And some data suggest it does. And then the other piece is if we're treating somebody for a drinking problem and we're tracking their personality, let's say they get better. This is, I think, in the recovery literature. You probably have a lot more to say about this than I do. Somebody who's abstinent, but they haven't shown the underlying personality change or growth, are they at higher risk for relapsing later? Right now, that's not part of typical clinical practice, but these data suggest it's worth looking at. And again, I think that's one area where the recovery movement has theorized more deeply, I think, than the treatment research community. I mentioned earlier that all of a sudden behaviorists are saying because these problems express themselves in so many different ways, maybe we ought to treat the next level below. And so even diehard behaviorists, when I was a graduate student, David Barlow, who's still very active, was, you know, our demigod, God, or whatever. I mean, he was everything there was about behavior therapy, and him and all of his colleagues of that generation just totally eschewed any kind of theorizing about personality. It was waste, it was an irrelevant construct, and it would just bog you down. Now we see people like David Barlow saying maybe that was wrong, because we're really looking more at transdiagnostic factors rather than these very specific diagnoses. The other piece is Brent Roberts, the same Brent Roberts who I showed you before, who had demonstrated in that meta-analysis personality change as a function of development. He has a recent Psych Bull review that this is, I think, 2017. Yeah, so January 2017, where he shows that you bring somebody in and treat them for depression or anxiety disorder, and what you see is personality change. And it's not just a function of a short-term effect. It doesn't look like it's an artifact of a retesting effect. It seems to be durable. That is, by treating certain kinds of behavioral disturbances, you're actually goading positive personality change. Now, we did look at substance use. There were positive effects. It wasn't as strong as the effects on mood disorders and anxiety disorders. On the other hand, it might have to do with the kind of interventions that are done. Cognitive behavioral treatment for anxiety and depression is really getting at the core process that we think generates anxiety and depression. And perhaps if we had other kinds of cognitive treatments that were targeting dependence processes, we might even see the same amount there. But there is an effect there. And for those people whose drinking is comorbid with these emotional problems, one would think it might be better. The other piece is environmental design, and that is creating environments that are incompatible with heavy drinking and meet basic personality-related needs. This is a paper that we published a number of years ago that actually I felt was one of our potentially most important policy-related pieces, where we looked at the effects of Friday classes on drinking on Thursday night. And I should say, too, is there's a lot of potential confounds. I encourage you to read the paper. I thought we did a pretty good job of ruling out most of the so-called Thirsty Thursday effect. And the fact that these Friday morning classes, if people drank more on Thursday, it's not like they drank less on Friday or Saturday. It wasn't just redistributing how much. There was a value-added bonus. The problem is it's hard to institute. Students don't like them, or particularly early Friday morning classes. You see by the time in the afternoon it doesn't affect. Professors don't want to teach them. If you have a business school, I don't know if it's like here, they don't want to be there Friday at all. At Iowa, though, they came up with a menu of different ways to try and encourage people to offer and take Friday morning classes. But I look at that as a pure role and compatibility effect. And this is just to highlight, in fact, the people who are in Iowa where they tried it were positive about it. The other thing which we do, for years I tried to tell what I believe would be a potentially useful thing to explore on campus, is keeping the gym open 24/7. You know, in Missouri, this looks like some resort somewhere, right? This is our rec center. And back in the day when I used to play racquetball regularly with my friend Tim, I would go by the weight room, and it was a scene. Everybody checking each other out, you know, and it was, you wouldn't believe it was a gym. You would think it's some kind of resort somewhere. And I was saying, well, they should keep this place open all the time, because if people are in the, you know, they're working out, they're able to show themselves off, seen and be seen, you know, but I don't know why it didn't fly. Maybe it's just too bold or weird a suggestion. But the idea is, can we create environments for the campus community that are largely drinking incompatible, but are still appealing? You know, one of the things they've done on our campus, and I used to discuss with the head of our campus prevention program, they do these mocktail hours. I don't know if they've done something like that here. And I was saying, you know, I mean, it's good that people come to them, but I think a lot of people just think of it as lame, you know? And so if you're gonna have an alternative activity, make it one that's like really fun, or, you know, and that's more engaging. And so, anyway, whenever I show this, people say, that is really your, and I just say, that is really Missouri. Okay. And then for prevention, in terms of early intervention, one of the things that's very impressive to come out of the Dunedin study, the Moffitt and Caspi study I related to, is these various measures of self-regulation that are in childhood predict substance use disorders 30 years later. And that, which says if we could get at these children at a very early age, you know, maybe we could mitigate some of that risk associated with it. And one they say is like, you know, opt-out options, where in order to, like what insurance companies do when they want you to enroll, now they put you in the thing they want you to be in, or that's in your best interest, and you have to opt out, is to have various kinds of choices along the way to kind of goad people into better choices. And then the other is target hardening, which would basically be various kinds of more individualized activities and you know, structural activities for increasing self-regulation. So the bottom line message is, plural here, is that personality plays an important role in substance use disorders, alcohol use disorders in particular, and I would argue psychopathology more generally. With alcohol, at least 3 different pathways that I highlighted: alcohol sensitivity, alcohol use motivation, and environmental selection. The big one take-home message, if you were not familiar with this before, is personality is not static, and it changes as a function of the course of development. Those changes are probably very important for looking at the prevalence of disorders over time. And the fact that it's malleable suggests whole new ranges of different targets for interventions. And with that, I assume I'm out of time.